So welcome to this Facebook Live on MECFS and identifying the stressors. If you're watching the replay, do just put #replay in the chat and do leave a comment so that other people can see this video. In this third part of the solving the MECFS puzzle, which is free training, if you want to watch the first two parts, do join my Facebook group and they're in the guide section. Or if you're watching on YouTube, if you go to the playlist that is titled Solving the MECFS Puzzle, you will find the other videos. So in the first couple of videos, we looked at some of the factors affecting health: heredity, environment, medical intervention, lifestyle, and resources. And we talked about the fact that there are three types of stress: acute stress, chronic stress, and psychological stress. I'd like to consider that, for instance, if we focus on environment, it might be that someone is exposed to mold, chemicals, or relationship that is toxic. That might affect them in terms of acute stress. So let's say if someone goes into a home where there's mold, they might have an acute response to that. If they visit someone who lives by a farm and they're spraying the fields with chemicals, they might have an acute response to that. Or if a relationship is particularly toxic, they might have a response to someone in that moment. But those stressors can also be chronic, ongoing stressors, and they can affect them psychologically. So for instance, if someone knows there's mold in the house, and at one point the bathroom was moldy when I had MECFS, and so I was a bit stressed when I was going to the bathroom because I was thinking this mold is going to make me feel worse. In the previous video, I talked about these 9 areas that I focus on when I'm working with someone. So we are just going to focus on that first step, which is identifying the stressors. Let's talk about why this is important. So it's important because if you consider this equation, E plus R equals O, you may have seen this before. E is the event, R is the response, and O is the outcome. So if we are responding to an event, it might be someone being judgmental about MECFS, saying it's in your head or whatever. If we generate stress, then that's going to cause us dis-ease. Now, if that's happening a lot of events plus stress, then that's going to add up and can contribute or make it more likely that we get diseases that make us sick. So I'd like you to consider this question and pop your answer in the chat if you want. You don't have to. But if you were to guess, what percentage of your responses, your thoughts, your feelings, even your behaviours, would you say are calming, nurturing and supportive, or neutral? A lot of people, when I ask that question, they say, actually, I recognise the percentage of thoughts I'm having each day that are calming, nurturing, supportive are quite low, which means that a lot of the time they're generating stress in their lives. All right, so I'd like to consider that. As I say, this session is about identifying the stressors. The challenge is that some of the stressors are unconscious. We don't realise that we're doing them. If we don't address the stressors, then this can lead to frustrations. We stay stuck. We don't see signs of recovery, and it's understandable if you get despondent. But some of the mistakes people make, number one, is that they believe that they can't influence their health. Sometimes people say, I've tried everything. And when I ask them to tell me what they've tried and how long they've done it, it's clear that they haven't tried everything, or they certainly haven't done it for very long. You know, for instance, I remember someone saying to me, I've tried meditation, it doesn't work. And I said, what do you mean it doesn't work? They said, well, my thoughts keep wandering off. And actually that's normal. So that's what our minds do. Our minds create thought and we wander off. Meditation is the art of noticing that our mind is wandering and bringing ourselves back to our anchor. It might be just observing our breath. Okay, So they weren't doing it wrong, but they were in their head, they were saying this isn't working, and then they just felt despondent and felt like they were a failure. And actually they were making a mistake because, actually they just needed to keep practicing that technique. And I've done meditation for years, and I did notice that after quite a long time, it was much easier to be mindful some of the time. And there are times when it's still challenging, if I am triggered, okay? So people believe they can't influence their health. They think they've tried stuff and then they lose motivation. But what I'd like you to consider is that being able to identify the stressors is a massive opportunity, because number one, it's the first step in breaking patterns. So often our unhelpful responses are habitual. There was some psychologist who said most people have the same thoughts that they had yesterday, and most of those thoughts aren't very helpful. So being able to identify the stresses is the first step to breaking the pattern. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes just observing or spotting the unhelpful response can actually help us shift from being in it, and I'll talk a bit more about that, to observing it. And when we do that, that can put the body in the healing state. So that doesn't happen always, but it can happen. And the more we practice that ability to identify the stressors, then the greater the possibility is that we can actually just become the observer and access that healing state. Okay. As I mentioned, challenge is that some of those responses are unconscious. So we need to be able to shift from being unconscious to conscious. And the first step of that is to understand the pieces or the components of our responses. Our responses can be our emotions, and so becoming aware of our emotional responses can actually help us shift from being unconscious to conscious. Sometimes our thinking is unconscious. We don't realize that we're generating a certain thought which is resulting in certain feelings. So having an understanding of the relationship between our emotions, between our thoughts, between our feelings can help us gain insights. We can shift from being in that state, in that emotion, where we're kind of, for example, if someone is driving along and someone cuts them up and now they're angry, they can be in that state of anger. Or they can be noticing, I'm generating anger in this situation. And they can process that experience, make sense of it, so that they become the observer. And when we become the observer, as I've said, we can actually create a shift. So it's really important that we know how to become aware of those unconscious responses, because once we bring them into our consciousness, then we actually can start to change them. And actually recently I did a Calm course, and this was a 6-week course, and we spent about 12 hours looking at this relationship between emotions, thoughts, and feelings. So I won't try and cover it in this video. I have made another short video where I touch on that, and I will link it to this video so you can watch it. So the question is, how do we become more conscious of what's going on? So let me explain this diagram. This is called Johari's window. So if we look at each of the squares, first of all, there's the stuff I know that's known to myself and known to others. So we call that the public self. So for instance, other people might know I'm a man. I know I'm a man. Okay. Some people who know me will know I haven't got any hair on my head, and I know that as well. All right. Then there's the stuff that is known to me, but unknown to others. That's the hidden self. So my secrets. Okay. So there are some things that other people don't know about me. Then there is the stuff that is unknown to me, but known to others. And they are my blind spots. Okay. Now, something very interesting happens is when I allow myself to be open to feedback from others, then the blind spots area becomes smaller. Okay. And if I decide to share some information with others, and it might be, for instance, some stuff that I felt a lot of shame around, but I share it, actually that can reduce the shame, and so my hidden self becomes smaller. And the net consequence of those two strategies is that the stuff that's unknown to me and unknown to others gets smaller. So that's a concept which I kind of find quite helpful, and I'll talk a bit more about the relevance of that in a minute. So how do we become more conscious? Well, the first thing is we can figure it out for ourselves. I was reading something about a book by a chap called Ryan Holiday, who's talking about Seneca's perspective on what Seneca calls euthymia. I was trying to get it pronunciation right. Have a guess if you know what euthymia means. Any guesses? Relates to what we're talking about. Vid says this is really enlightening. Well, I was chatting to someone, Vid, who was saying I need a kind of guide. You know, she said the word guru, and I said, well, I wouldn't call myself a guru, but I am bald, so does that help? And she laughed, and she hired me. So glad you're finding it enlightening. Euthymia means tranquility, and Ryan Holiday says, so he asks this question: so why do you do what you do? That's the question you need to answer. Stare at it until you can. Only then will you understand what matters and what doesn't. Okay, so one strategy is, by practicing meditation, mindfulness, we grow in our awareness, we have insights. Because when we're stilling the mind, there's more kind of space for stuff to come to us. There's a very interesting story that Jack Canfield tells about a chap who's an entrepreneur. He's into real estate, does a lot of meditation, and he says, Jack Canfield says, this guy often has a lot of insights or intuitions that come to him from stilling his mind. And one example is that one time he's meditating about 8 p.m, and he gets this idea just popping into his head as if from nowhere, that he needs to go to a place, I think called Kingman, Arizona. And he says, that doesn't make sense. If I leave now, I'll get there in the early hours. So he decides to go to bed and get up at 3 a.m. and drive to this place. And he arrives in Kingman, Arizona, goes to the cafe, buys a local newspaper, and he's sitting having his coffee and his breakfast, and he opens to the real estate ads, and there's an advert for a 4-corner property. And this is something he's wanted to buy, and he's never been able to in this town, and he's not been able to because someone always pips him to it. So he goes straight to the estate agents, or whatever they call them in America. That's what we call them in the UK. Might be a realtor, and says, is this property still available? And the chap says, yes, it is. We only put the advert out last night. You're the first person to come to the office. And so he was able to buy this property as a result of sitting quietly in his home at 8 o'clock in the evening. How cool is that? So we can get insights by figuring it out, by clearing our mind, stilling our mind. But that can be a slow way of doing things, okay? So, second strategy is knowledge, okay? So we can get information which gives us insight. So one of the things I do, and this is something I do in a free chat and I'm not selling anything in the free chat. Every week I do 3 half-hour sessions, and we score a number of metrics. So the first one there is physical health. The second one is compassion towards yourself. The third one, which is the question I've asked already, what are the percentage of thoughts that are calming, nurturing, supportive? We score a number of other metrics, and sometimes people are aware of these metrics, but often I've had a couple of chats with people this week, and it helped them understand why it might be important to learn strategies to help them identify their unhelpful responses, interrupt them, and create new responses. Because they recognized all their numbers were pretty low, and they recognized that meant that their body was in a state of stress a lot of the time. Okay, so I've got a list of, I'm guessing 30, 40, 50 different patterns that can activate the stress response. And often just by sharing some of them, I remember I did a free talk to a bunch of lawyers, and one of the patterns I talked about was futile frustrations. Any guesses what futile frustrations are? Feel free to pop your guess in the chat. I'll give you a moment. I know there's a bit of time delay between me speaking and you replying, but have a guess. I can see there's a few people watching. Any guesses what futile frustrations are? Any takers? Anyone going to be bold and have a guess? So I'll let you know, but if you're typing, keep typing. So futile frustrations are when we get frustrated about things that we can't change. For instance, being stuck in traffic. And when I shared that, this chap in the... Yeah, Rachel says they are kind of pointless. Exactly right. When I shared that with this group, I was doing this free presentation to a bunch of lawyers. Viv says, wasting energy on things that you can't do anything about. Exactly right. When I shared that, later on this chap said to me, who's quite a senior lawyer, he said, that was a light bulb moment for me because I realised I spent a lot of time generating frustration about things I can't change. And just that insight actually meant that I stopped doing that. Okay, so sometimes we can get some information. As I say, I've got a list of different patterns and traits that can actually put us into that stress response. And when people look at that, they start thinking, oh, okay, I can see that I do those things. And so now they're aware of them, they can watch out for them. And the next thing you can do is identify the recipe for those unhelpful responses. So, and we do this number one, sometimes we figure it out. Number two, we get information that gives us insight. The third way is to get feedback. Okay, I'll give you a few examples of that. So I was working with a client or I've worked with a few clients, and they've showed me, they've done kind of brain training method, and they've showed me how they do a stop. And it seems very clear to me that when they do their stop, they're generating stress. And so I say to them, what would it be like to do a stop like this? Pause. Or I hear you. And so give them a few options, and they say, oh wow, that feels very different. And I said, in what way is it different? They say, I feel calmer. Okay, so sometimes people are doing a kind of stop to interrupt a pattern, but it's actually just generating more stress. Okay, and this happens a lot, chatting with a client, and I'll identify something that they don't realize they're doing. Another example of that, actually, I remember one client, before I move on, I was training a group of people in Bergen in Norway, and this woman was doing a pause, and she decided to use the word stop, but every time she did a stop, it was like this, stop. It was very fierce, it was very kind of stern, and she did it about 18 times before she actually did a calmer stop. And she was very emotional when she did that, because that was a breakthrough for her, because she was not used to talking to herself in that way. Okay. So another example, and this is something that I've seen a lot. I'll be training someone and they'll say, "Can I ask a question?" And I say something to them along the lines of, "I'm happy to answer any question, but I invite you to say, instead of 'can I ask a question,' I have a question." Okay, try that out. Say, "Can I ask a question?" and then say, "I have a question." What difference do you notice? Again, feel free to put your answer in the chat. What's the difference between saying, "Can I ask a question?" and "I have a question"? Vid saying me. Yeah, you're just one of those people, Vid, all right? There are others, okay? So what difference do you notice between those two statements? Well, one's a question, one's a statement. I'll let you answer that. So Vid's saying, "I've learned." Excellent. All right. And another pattern I notice when I work with people, not with everyone, but some people, I'll ask a question and they're like a greyhound. They're very quick to answer it. And they often talk very quickly. And when we're talking quickly, it might be because we're excited or we're feeling some emotion. But again, that can be putting the body into a stress state. I remember going on holiday when I had ME/CFS, and because I felt that I hadn't had enough time, or I felt like I'd missed out on time with people, when I was with people, I was like really animated, and like we'd have a meal or whatever. I was on this holiday, we'd have breakfast and lunch and dinner. After every meal, I felt exhausted because I was really animated. And this was a place where there were lots of trainers and therapists, and about 5 people said to me, "You really got to be aware of your breath." And so I started listening to that, because they were right. Because when I was interacting with people, I was so excited to have some human contact that I was kind of losing myself, getting a bit too over animated, and as a result, completely exhausting myself. Okay, so Tracy says, "Can I ask a question?" sounds apologetic, asking for permission. Exactly right. Okay, and how does "I have a question" sound? Often people say, "Oh, that feels empowering." Okay, and that's my job, is to help empower people. So I think that, yeah, so Tracy says, "I have a question, feels more like honouring my need for information without asking permission." Beautifully put, Tracy. That's exactly right. I love that. You've put it much more eloquently than I did. So if we understand the unhelpful recipes, okay, we understand the components, might be an emotion, might be a thought, might be a feeling, then we can actually change the recipe and get a different result. Okay, and that's kind of what I do when I'm working with people, helping people identify the unhelpful stuff, interrupting those unhelpful responses, and creating new responses. So we'll talk about the interrupt phase in the next Facebook Live. I've touched on it a bit today, maybe gave away some of my content for next time, but that's fine. If you've got any questions, pop them in the chat. Just to say, next week I am going to be starting the Building Resilience group training. If you'd like to watch the video to find out more about that, just put the word "group" in the chat and tag me. So start typing my name and click on it so it comes up. Then I'll get a notification. If I don't respond, just send me a message, private message. But in short, it's really important to identify the stressors, the unhelpful responses, because it can help us activate the healing state. And for example, there's research that shows that meditation impacts our immune system. So if you'd like to know more about the group program, comment in the chat if you're watching on YouTube, click the link in the banner and send me a message. Put the word group in the message, I'll send you the video. So if you've got any questions, pop them in the chat, tag me. Colin says thanks. Vid says thanks for this. You are welcome. Do like, comment and share the video if you found it helpful. And say, got any questions, pop them in the chat or get in touch. Thanks for watching. Wishing you great health. Bye for now.